So we're going to get going. We have Peter Swire Skyping in, but all I want to do is introduce you to your moderator. Probably everybody knows Nancy Libin, who's former Chief Privacy Officer for the Department of Justice. She's now with the law firm of Jenner and Block. And Nancy, you want to take it away?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, IEF, for this tremendous effort pulling this off on such a snowy after such a snowy weekend. Thanks everybody for joining today. I'm going to introduce our panelists and give a little table setting and explain what we're here to talk about today. At the end of the table we have Jim Halpert from DLA Piper. Next to Jim is David Robinson from Upturn. And here next to me is Daniel Castro from ITIF. And we have Peter Swire, who is Skyping in Peter is a professor from Georgia Tech, former privacy czar in the Clinton White House, and has, of course, a long history of working on these issues, and it's great to have him to be able to participate remotely today. So before I turn it over to Peter to give a little bit of a background presentation on his recent research, I want to just set the table a bit and explain why we're talking about this issue, the visibility that ISPs and other online entities have into the internet activities of consumers online. As you all undoubtedly know, the FCC adopted an order almost a year ago now, establishing new open internet rules, relying on Title II to reclassify broadband internet access services as telecommunications services. This order expressly applied certain provisions that the FCC has used to regulate the use and disclosure of certain customer information. The order expressly applies those provisions to internet service providers. Specifically, a particular provision, Section 222 of the Communications Act, which regulates a particular kind of customer information. The FCC plans to conduct a rulemaking soon to determine how this statutory provision would apply to ISPs. The rules in place now are very telephone-centric. The statute is very telephone-centric. And so we are here today to talk about the online ecosystem, the business models, the kinds of consumer expectations that we find online, because we think that that will help inform policy going forward and how new rules ought to apply to internet service providers in this space. So with that said, I want to turn this over to Peter to give background on the research he's done on data collection, use, and disclosure online, and in particular ISPs.
Okay, well thank you, Nancy, and thanks to Tim and all the State of the Net people for making this work despite the weather. Let me just ask on a technical side, first of all, is the volume okay for people? Can they hear me? Nod your heads, yeah, okay. And the second thing is, are you seeing both me and some slides at the moment? Okay, that's great. It's hard for me to tell otherwise. So just as preview, I'm sorry I couldn't make it to Washington today. We all understand the snow. And I'm heading out to Brussels right as this panel is finishing. I'm going to the airport. So I have to get off around 3:20 p.m. today. And along those lines, I'll be in Brussels by tomorrow, and we'll be debating Max Schrems on US-EU privacy tomorrow. And there will be a live audio feed, and if we're lucky, a live video feed up on YouTube, which I've just shown the highlight for. So that may be of interest to people, though that's not the focus of the report today, just something else going on this week. Okay, so the introduction here, as Nancy has said, and as that you all know, there's been this very hot topic about the role of ISPs in the internet, and including broadband privacy. And last April, I was invited by the FCC to come talk to them in their hearing, and there was a big factual disagreement. Some people who were speaking said that ISPs see everything. Some people said that ISPs don't see that very much. And this struck me as a factual issue and not just a policy issue. That's what this research is supposed to be. I'd hope to have it done by today, but with Safe Harbor and all, it's slipped just a little bit. So in the research, it's a description of the facts. I am not making any policy statements or recommendations or legal conclusions. And I think accurate description is key to good policy, and I think pretty much everyone does. And I'm hoping that my experience in the field can be taken as a constructive thing where people from different points of view can converge on what the facts are like. As I said, this responds to questions raised by the FCC in April. We have a detailed report expected within a month and is co-authored with my colleagues Justin Hemmings and Alana Kirkland. And I've said this today and sent it around to the panel in advance, but if anyone sees mistakes in the facts that are being presented here, either now in this phase or after publication, I'm really underlining to please let us know, and we're going to engage with it and correct any mistakes that we find. With that said, I disagree, and this is sort of I think the newsworthy part, at least what Politico thought was newsworthy. I disagree with two factual statements in the letter last week from the 59 privacy groups. I did not see the letter until after it was published, so I didn't have an opportunity to say to folks before it went out, hey, I have a different view on the facts. And I've worked with a lot of those groups over the years. I'm, in fact, a policy fellow with one of them. And I hope I don't get cast out of the group of people who care about privacy by trying to report accurately on the facts here. But we'll see what happens. It's a tough town. So the first of two things where there's contrasting views between that letter last week and my own view of the facts. The first one is something that we've seen in a lot of settings, which is along the lines that ISPs, Internet Service Providers, have comprehensive visibility into user Internet activity. And my own view is that's not true in this day and age and will be less true going forward. Notably, encryption, such as the widely used SSL and the widely used HTTPS, encryption blocks content. So to the extent people have worried in the past about deep packet inspection, about ISPs looking into the content, if it's encrypted with HTTPS, then the ISP lacks the ability to do that unless it somehow breaks the encryption, and we don't have reason to think that they do. Similarly, the standard encryption being widely used today blocks detailed links. So if you go to a search engine or some other website, a news site, you'll find out it was at the search engine or was at CNN.com, but you don't find out the detailed links. And encryption has been spreading widely. So that's the first key factual point. The second key factual point has to do with another quote in the letter last week. And the letter said there's no way for consumers to avoid data collection by entities that provide internet access service. And again, my views are just factual here, which is virtual private networks. If I'd been there in person, I would have asked how many people have ever used one, and most of you would have said yes. But VPNs block the ISP access to content and detailed links. And VPNs go beyond the other encryption by also blocking even the top level URL. So when I sign on to Georgia Tech, they only find out I signed on to my Georgia Tech VPN. The ISP doesn't see anything more. And VPN use has climbed, and I think will continue to climb. So what's going on here is a factual contrast between the 1990s view some of us grew up in and today. The 1990s view of an ISP, there was a desktop or a laptop at home. People connected through unencrypted communications, and the ISP did the DNS lookup for all the surfing. And that's changed a lot. So today people have multiple devices, often logged in at Wi-Fi and other hotspots. There's heavy encryption, and there's heavy use of VPN. So let me go to, and I should have done this larger, sorry. Here's the first of our pretty new slides that Marie-Le Pichon gets credit for, one of my grad students here. And this is showing the effects of HTTPS, the HTTP secure protocol. So if we look at the top step one in the diagram, I hope it's big enough to see, there's what's called DNS or domain name system lookup. And over on the left of it in blue, the user says, I want to visit Comfy Shoes. It goes over to the ISP, says, where's this Comfy Shoes located? And the ISP looks up the internet protocol address, 208.67, sends it back to the user, and now the user can go to comfyshoes.com, which is our example in this. Step two, once we have an IP address to go to, under HTTP, the traditional protocol, is can you send me to 208.67? It goes through the ISP in unencrypted form. It comes back through the ISP in unencrypted form, and all of the details about Comfy Shoes or CNN get seen there. And that's shown graphically by the three circles next to over HTTP. The first circle shows the high-level www link. The green circle shows the deep, detailed links, which are often very detailed in modern surfing. And the third part, oh, actually, I got it backwards. The second part is content, and the third part is the deep link. So an ISP under an HTTP approach has a technical capability when it tries to do it to see these things. But over HTTPS at the bottom, things changed. So under HTTPS, the user does a handshake with comfyshoes.com. It goes through the ISP in encrypted form with those blue arrows, and then the ISP delivers it back in encrypted form, and the user gets to see all the Comfy Shoes stuff, but the ISP is seeing encrypted content and encrypted deep links. So that's a change. And the VPN, at least the VPNs that use encryption, which is many of them but not all of them, the VPNs goes deeper than that. So on this slide, virtual private networks, the user on the left has a blue user. I want to establish a VPN, like when I go to Georgia Tech. It goes through the ISP and establishes a handshake with the VPN on the right of the screen, the yellow. And now we have an encrypted tunnel between the user and the proxy server. Step 2 is it goes to the proxy server under traditional lookup. The proxy server would be do the domain name lookup, but when it goes back to the user, the ISP is still just seeing the tunnel. And a third diagram shows how HTTPS affects this even more. The user starts, it goes through the ISP by a tunnel. If it's HTTPS, once it's looked up, even the VPN does not see the deep links or the content. Even the VPN only sees the top level domain. So there's a blockade within a blockade, including in terms of visibility. This slide I'll do relatively briefly. It'll be a longer discussion in the tunnel in the final report. But if you start at the bottom of this slide, the slide here is ISPs less than I think conventional wisdom thinks, or less than I thought before I dug into the facts here. So if we go down to the bottom in the purple, we see that ISPs are facing a world where it's not one person logging on from home or logging on from home and work. Instead, 60% of Americans today spend time on mobile apps. Mobile is the coming domination. There's almost 500,000 Wi-Fi hotspots. And so the full picture of an ISP turns into a fractured picture to the extent individuals are doing part of their surfing through any one ISP. The second part in terms of ISP visibility by delivering ISP is that people have different devices. The number of network devices is climbing rapidly. People have tablets, people have smartphones. And so the ISP is connecting a device, but it doesn't necessarily, though it may sometimes, have an ability to link across devices. The third one up from the bottom, the green one, is what we just talked about, is the effective encryption and virtual private networks and other encrypted proxy servers. And the top one comes back to this word comprehensive, which is there unique or comprehensive visibility to ISPs, which is, again, the factual claim that has been made in a lot of the debate so far. And I think when you look at the debate and look at it compared to a variety of other actors in the internet online ecosystem, online behavioral advertising and operating systems and social networks and search and e-commerce and browsers and all the rest, the uniqueness or comprehensiveness claim doesn't stand up very well compared to how things work in today's internet. So conclusion slide, and then we'll go to comments and questions. We'll go to David in the comments and questions. The important policy issues, such as how to regulate a big industry and regulate internet access, should be founded on careful and factual understanding of today's technologies and tomorrow's technologies, and not based on assumptions about the way ISPs used to work. Encryption applies broadly today to key internet activities. I've listed some of them here. When you go to your bank or your healthcare provider or almost any e-commerce site that you pay with, that's encrypted. Search is overwhelmingly encrypted today. Social networks are massively encrypted today. Text messaging, WhatsApp, and other internet-based messaging is encrypted today. Netflix has announced they're going to go encrypted this year. And webmail is overwhelmingly encrypted today. And Chris Sagoyan and others have, and I've worked on this for a long time in encryption, have documented how incomplete that was as recently as 2012. But post-Snowden, there's a huge adoption of encryption in a variety of ways. And encryption means you get the top-level domain, but not the deep links and not the content. And then beyond that, VPNs and other encrypted proxy servers are large and are likely to grow. And so any claims the ISP has unique or comprehensive access has to be tested against these facts, and I think the policy debate should be shaped by what's happening here. So briefly, some credits. Marie Lepichon did the fantastic slides, and you're welcome to use them with a Creative Commons license. And I have research support from Georgia Tech Business and Georgia Tech Institute for Information Security and Privacy, and from Broadband for America. the words that are said here are my words. People have gotten to see and give comments, but they haven't gotten to edit them. So there you go. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was terrific. And I want to ask David if he'd like to respond to some of the comments.
Sure. Thank you, and thanks, Peter, for a very thoughtful conversation. I'll say that Upturn has been following this extremely closely. We were not involved in the preparation of the letter that was mentioned, but we did assist the Open Technology Institute at New America with the preparation of its own report, which was also released last week and speaks to substantially these questions. Like Peter, I speak only for myself. Like him, I'm focused here on describing facts, not policy recommendations, and corrections are certainly welcome. I think Peter's presentation tells us a lot about the kinds of cloak and dagger maneuvers that are available to someone who zealously wishes to protect their privacy from their ISP. But in my opinion, the practical question that matters most here is how an ISP is situated relative to a typical user. And so I'd like to start with the straw poll that Peter suggested, with perhaps a slight addition. How many of you in the room would say that privacy is important to you? And then do me a favor and hold your hand up if you have, keep hands up if you used a VPN, let's say, within the last week. And keep them up if the VPN that you used within the last week was not one provided by your employer. Anyone? Okay, there are 3 hands up in the room out of about 25, or four out of 25 people. And here's what I'll say is that if you wanted to build a room where the consumer adoption of VPNs was as high as it is anywhere, this room would be a good place to start. It's by no means representative of most internet consumers. So I could say that, you know, VPNs may not hide your DNS queries, but the thing that we have to keep in mind is that when we get to that level of technical description, we're way beyond what most users of broadband service are going to experience. And so I just briefly want to go through a half dozen of the ways that ISPs can, in fact, still see what's going on in a user's internet connection, and how I would argue that broadband providers are certainly unique. I don't know about what we would exactly mean by comprehensive, but certainly it is a unique perspective and a very revealing one that they have on internet use. Firstly, what's going on inside your house? When you're home and you're using Internet of Things devices like an internet-connected lock, thermostat, or security camera, what can the ISP know about your behavior, like when you're home, when the lights are being turned on or off, what even sometimes security cameras transmit in the clear? And I'll point to recent work by Nick Feemster and others at Princeton on this that substantiates these concerns in what I found to be an unnerving level of detail. A second example, so keep in mind, if you're not using a consumer VPN for your personal browsing, then even if the traffic is encrypted, as a growing fraction of the web is, the ISP is still going to see those requests for which domain name you want to access, which is to say those DNS queries, which are still transmitted in the clear, meaning not encrypted. Even if you might have heard about DNSSEC, that's about verifying the accuracy cryptographically of results that you receive. Even when that's in use, your queries are encrypted in the, your queries are in the clear when they go out, which means that AT&T Uverse, for example, which claims the power to, quote, use your individual web browsing information to target offers and otherwise commercially use that information, they're going to know, are you a christianmingle.com type or more of an okcupid.com person? Or maybe you're not dating, maybe you're at more of a babiesareus.com phase of life. They're going to know that. And as is the case with metadata in other contexts, it can be, and in the aggregate typically is, extremely revealing. Thirdly, some stuff, as we've all pointed out, is unencrypted. For example, if you go to WebMD, whatever ailment you look up, the path is going to be public. Only 40% or slightly less than 40% of federal.gov websites are encrypted. If you're submitting a whistleblower complaint to the Ag Department, you're still doing that over a link that's in the clear. Fourthly, location, especially with respect to mobile broadband ISPs. You know, which grocery store are you loyal to? Do you spend much time? Have you spent much time at the hospital lately? Do you have kids in private school? All these things are inevitably, no matter how privacy motivated you may be, available to your service provider, and you might not know it, but already today, Verizon claims the right to use your device's location history and your browsing history, and they go out to other brokers and match this with gender, age range, interests, and shopping preferences. Fifthly, private browsing that it turns out isn't really private. Even when you clear your cookies and open up a special private browser for whatever it is that might be the most sensitive or intimate uses that you make of the internet, there's a growing use of active interventions on the part of the ISPs to tag your traffic in ways that they and others can see. So we've seen, you might have heard about perma-cookie injection. So Verizon front runs traffic now with signals that they add to it that tell the world, this so-called UIDH header, who you are. 6 months after rolling out the program, in response to public pressure, they introduced an opt-out option. But I want to be clear that that was, according to them, strictly at their discretion and not something that the law required them to offer. And lastly, as a final example of something that is definitely visible to ISPs, think about video service. So as Peter mentioned, it's likely that by the end of 2016, although it's not true today, a majority of the packets exchanged on the North American internet may be TLS encrypted. The reason that's true is because Netflix, which represents 34% of total downstream bandwidth, has announced it's going to encrypt by the end of 2016. But even when they do encrypt, the ISP is typically going to see your traffic and know that it's Netflix. And in fact, even if you use a VPN, if you've got gigabytes of data that are flowing to you at a steady rate on a Saturday, it's not hard to infer that that is an over-the-top video binge-watching session. And we know we've all been there. And so a policy question for another day, should an ISP, or perhaps for later in this discussion, should an ISP be permitted to use such information for purposes other than managing its network or providing your service? Purposes, for example, such as an individualized pricing offer to people that the ISP has identified as heavy users of a competing over-the-top video service. And the final thing I'll say and then close and let us all discuss is that one reason that the role of ISPs is particularly concerning is the relative lack, when compared with application providers, of choice that people have, especially on the wireline side in broadband provision, where the FCC finds that for a majority of Americans, if you want a modern, robust broadband connection, that is to say one that is 25 or more megabits per second, you're going to find that for about 53% of Americans, there's just one option. So what they decide to make the price of admission in terms of how much data you surrender becomes a very important, I think, and a very relevant salient question for regulators. I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. Jim, did you want to? You look like you
sure. Just speaking practically, this is a very well constructed debater's argument, positing that there is access to a lot of information, then positing that there is no choice, using a particular aspirational definition that the FCC put forward for universal service funding purposes, its definition of broadband is 10 megabits, not 25. And when it's found that I think 98% of Americans have a choice of 3 megabit per second wireless ISPs. So in fact, the real choice here is more like 4 or 5 for most Americans. So there is choice, actually. And ISPs have a very strong incentive not to creep out their users, because unlike all the other players in the internet ecosystem, they have a direct revenue stream that they're obtaining from consumers, and they have an incentive to retain their trust. The argument about high-level DNS information coming to the ISP puts the ISP on exactly the same level as any other player in the whole internet advertising ecosystem. And indeed, the encryption would actually trend to give the ISP less information than an operating system provider, for example, who will see all the information unencrypted. Or if somebody goes through a social media platform or some other online platform to access content, that information is then read when the consumer moves on. And meanwhile, there are entities in the advertising ecosystem who have far, far more information. And really, I think from a public policy perspective, we need to think about whether we move toward a world, and this is what the OTI report is aimed at, where a tiny fraction of the internet ecosystem is subject to a far, far greater degree of regulation than anybody else. Those players need, people who provide broadband service are making very, very significant investments in infrastructure that under the net neutrality order, and I happen to agree with the net neutrality order, but the consequence of the net neutrality order is that anybody else can ride over that investment. To say that the whole rest of the advertising world that has the ISPs play a very small role in, that has far more data than any ISP should be able to, should not be subject to the FTC regulatory framework, but now ISPs, which have operated under that framework for years and did not engage in outrages and were not more intrusive than the ad networks by any means, should suddenly be subject to a very, very rigorous opt-in regime that would make investment for other competitors in the broadband world a much riskier position. If we care about competition in broadband, which is part of the whole premise of FCC regulation, we don't want to create huge barriers to what will be substantial investments. And I think that the logic of this, I think this comes out as pretty much a wash when I hear your points, David, in terms of the position of the ISP and the position of other players, and to have a discriminatory, weird sort of special regulation of that category of people raises some troubling implications if we want to encourage broadband competition and investment in broadband networks.
So what I heard there, at the end of what Jim was saying, there, just to break it into two buckets, there is a question of whether asymmetric regulation is justified, warranted, based on the technology and the way that the ecosystem operates, and then also what are the consequences of that. So before we get to the latter, what the consequences of asymmetric regulation would be, because I think there's significant policy issues there, let's just focus just a bit more on whether the asymmetric regulation is justified. I don't want to leave that topic just yet, because I think there's more to unpack here. So I'd invite, I don't know, Daniel, if you want to comment on that issue, or if Peter then afterwards would like to comment.
Actually, let me invite Peter to first respond to what was said here, and then let me comment on that.
Okay, and I want to put back up the slide about HTTPS for a second. And is it visible to you all right now or not? The slide.
Yeah.
It is?
No.
Okay, I have to go back to shared screen. And the reason is I'm going to need to jump off in a minute, and I apologize for that because I want to make my flight. But I want to just sort of make sure, and now is there a slide showing? Yes? No? Yes. Okay. And this is a question to David, and if you're not comfortable, David, then we'll follow up later. But on this basic fact about HTTPS, which has become much more common in recent years, is it your understanding that the shift that in a HTTP world, an ISP, if they decide to go after it, could see top link and detailed link and content, but today deep link and content get blocked under HTTPS, and so the most they get is top level link. Is there any qualifications or limitations on that, or does that seem to be accurate from what you understand about HTTPS?
Yeah, that essentially matches my understanding, and I hope that nothing I said seemed to, certainly I didn't intend to imply otherwise, but I think the question that's also a piece of this is how much information can be inferred out of those domain names.
And so I'm gonna, I thank you, Dave. I mean, I have read and admired David's work in a lot of respects, and so on this important point, just factually describing things, the shift to encryption has this effect on what ISPs even could do, assuming they can't break the encryption, which I don't think they're going to be trying to do. So I'm going to leave the policy debates to others. That's sort of the role I decided to play here. But I think it's useful to see that there's agreement, I think, and there's going to keep being agreement that in an HTTPS world there's been a big change. So I'm going to sign off at that, I think. and wish you all good luck, and we'll probably revisit this a lot more. So thanks.
Thank you, Peter.
Great. Thanks. And I think that's a really useful place to start because, when I was hearing both sides of this conversation, I read Peter's work, I read the New America Foundation report, and, they both, I think, highlight, some common facts and they have different emphasis, but the New America report ends up in a very different place. And, I think it's important to realize what is very common in these two areas. I mean, certainly, it's important to know that ISPs can analyze data to determine things about the individual. That's why we have targeted advertising that ISPs are able to roll out, and that's a very good thing. I don't think there's no kind of lack of understanding about the fact that the reason they have some of these opt-in or opt-out programs is so specifically they can do advertising to benefit the consumer. But I also agree that with Peter that there's definitely this trend when we look at what's happening in the world of technology towards more encryption. And as we move in this direction, there will be changes that affect what ISPs will be able to see in this area. If you look at what Google announced now about a year ago, they specifically said that search results would be the part of their search algorithm ranking was going to be using whether or not a site has HTTPS on it. So they said that right now it's going to be a very small signal, but later on they really wanted to encourage sites to move in this direction and that they'd make that a larger signal. So we can see this as a trend that will play out over time. Certainly I'm not surprised that federal agencies are lagging. They've been lagging in many areas. And we also have to, I think, look at what the response is likely from consumers. I agree with your poll here in the room that a lot of people aren't using VPNs right now. I think for very good reasons. They don't have a real reason to. If they felt compelled to, they likely would. And these are the changes that we generally see play out. When people install ad blockers when they were tired of ads or angry about the ads they were seeing. I think people would move towards using VPNs if they felt that there was some value to them for paying for that service and going through the maybe somewhat difficult process of installing it. But I also think the fact that when we kind of poll everyone in the room about this, the fact that we don't have a lot of people saying they're using VPNs or concerned about this kind of brings us to the question of why this is a policy discussion, whether or not it's a legitimate one to be having right now. Because we're not having a panel discussion right now about whether or not advertising online is a good thing. We're not having a panel discussion about whether targeted advertising is a good thing. This is specifically about whether the FCC should be regulating ISPs, and in this case, it's really should be regulating them in a unique way that's different than the rest of the internet ecosystem. So a lot of the work that I've done in the past has been looking at how the FTC has regulated online advertisers and how the voluntary practices, the codes of conduct, the notice and consent, how all of those frameworks have led to the consumer options that are available today, and whether or not they empower consumers or not. I think it's important to look at it in this kind of historical and evolving context of what the FTC is doing when we start asking questions about what the FCC should be doing, because we're not. The question here is really, is something bad happening to consumers that's unique that the FCC should be taking action against? That's the policy question. And I think even for those who are very concerned about privacy, I have a hard time seeing in this space where there's that unique, compelling reason to regulate differently, specifically because I would put this to the panel, can you name a single ISP that doesn't allow consumers to opt out of these types of advertising practices? And if there's not, then what's the reason for FCC intervention here?
Sure. So let me respond to a couple of things. One is, I think how competitive you think the broadband market is depends totally, as Jim points out, on what you think counts. So if you think that a 3 megabit wireless link is enough and that it's in the same market as a 25 megabit coax link, then you think, well, there's lots of competition. If, on the other hand, you happen to believe, as I happen to believe, that a 25 megabit link is best understood as a different kind of product in terms of what it allows consumers to do, or at least a different subtype of broadband, then there's not a lot of competition on the wireline side. So I think we see the same facts and have different perspectives on them.
Could I ask a question about that, though?
Sure.
Are you proposing that this new set of rules apply to broadband providers who provide 25 megabit per second service, or are you also going to apply it all the way through the ISP internet access market? When I read the OTI report, it doesn't propose limiting and creating a special category of regulation for markets where businesses are really investing a lot of money to provide particularly fast broadband, and there isn't a choice beyond that entity.
Well, let me ask you, how would you feel about such a proposal?
I don't think it would make a lot of sense, but I'm also not sure that special rules for internet access providers where consumers clearly have a broad choice make much sense either.
Well, this may be beyond my pay grade as a supposed to be providing here, the facts, but I'll point out that as it's an unresolved, first of all, I mean, as it's an unresolved debate, I think that the question of whether the regulation is best described, quote, as asymmetric, that's question begging. If we call it asymmetric regulation, we're adopting the view that there's not a relevant difference between the regulated parties and other parties, and I think that's exactly what this discussion is about. And I just wanted to finally, when we're talking about what are people buying, as Daniel brought up about VPNs and other sorts of products that might preserve privacy, I think it's worth noticing that when, for example, Uverse provides its opt-out and it's a $30 a month sort of a thing, that compares radically with the amount of money that actually can be gotten from users' data. So, Wall Street watches very closely average advertising revenue per user. Google, which is far and away the winner of that game, gets $45 per user per year, not per month. And Facebook gets about $10 per user per year. So when AT&T says, our ability to comprehensively record and to sell what you're doing is worth $30 a month, what they're doing is overpricing that to create a new normal. And I'll say finally that as to your question of whether there are meaningful opt-outs for each such tracking program, I think history teaches us that we're not sure because, in fact, we don't have comprehensive visibility into such tracking. And so when, for example, the Verizon tracking began, there was a 6-month period where no opt-out was afforded. Could someone else be doing that now and those of us who are concerned about this not be aware of it? I think the reasonable answer is that that's a reasonable possibility.
Well, I want to respond to 2 things. I mean, one, I have looked at the ISP's privacy policies, and anyone can. I mean, they're all all the major ones are online, and I think they're pretty explicit about what they're doing with data, what consumer options are available, and they know that the FTC could certainly take action against them if they're violating that. And so I hear you saying that we don't know what's going on, but we kind of do. I mean, they're saying it pretty clearly, and if they don't do what they say, they'll be held accountable for that. So I think we have to be a little careful with that. But what I think a little more concerned about is when you talked about the discounts that you get if you opt into these programs. I mean, I'm an AT&T Uverse consumer. I don't know if I need to disclose that for some kind of bias there. I did opt to take the $30 discount. Seemed like a really decent deal to me. And I certainly recognize that some people would say, oh, they're getting too high margins on this trade-off or something. But the answer to that, though, would be, it sounds like you're kind of hinting at, is price regulation of ISPs. Because if you're saying that you won't allow ISPs to price their services the way they want, I mean, that's saying, that's moving from a privacy discussion into a price regulation discussion. And I don't think that's something the FCC is interested in doing. I don't think that's good policy, but I'm wondering if that's really what you're talking about.
I mean, the way that I would see it, and again, I should hasten to add, I speak only for myself here, is that what we're talking about is less how many dollars can be charged for the product and more a question of what the product is.
But because it sounded like you were uncomfortable with, a $30 discount. And it seems to me this is the type of policy that we actually want the FCC, when they go through any kind of rulemaking, to make sure that this isn't hurt. You want consumers to be able to get more affordable internet access. You want them to be able to receive these types of discounts, just like we have in the rest of the online advertising space. A lot of consumer benefit from all this innovation around how we can, create new business models and use data and use personalized advertising, I would think we would want the same thing with broadband providers and make sure ISPs can do that. And it's not just ISPs, I'll add, it's also, the personalized advertising on cable TV boxes and everything like that, where we see this trend going. When we talk about technology trends, this is a big upcoming trend. We want to make sure all of that is still enabled in the future. But you can't do that if you tell ISPs, but you can't pass these benefits on to consumers in the form of lower prices, or if you restrict these types of products and services.
And I'd add one other point with regard to the AT&T situation. AT&T very forthrightly put out very, very clear notice about this offer to consumers, and that's why there's a lot of focus on this. There's a huge universe of people of entities that are trading consumer data or collecting health data, all these other things, and they're not providing clear notice and presenting a value proposition to users. So it seems to me that net, both in providing consumers with a choice, you may disagree with the value that was presented, but that's the market ultimately. This is actually closer to consumers, much more transparent, and in the end, there's a much greater restraint on a broadband ISP acting creepy with consumer data, because they lose an awful lot of money. The value of a subscriber who's getting broadband service and some other service is huge. To focus on this small subset of the internet ecosystem and say, let's go to town and really, really establish huge regulatory burdens on them and restrict their uses of information, when the whole rest of the internet ecosystem is subject to the FTC framework, and the FCC could very easily adopt rules that replicate what the FTC rules that have long applied in this context. It seems to me that it's a little bit arbitrary to focus on this particular part of the ecosystem and say we need to really regulate these guys and leave everybody else under the FTC regime. If the FTC regime is good enough for others, it ought to be good enough for ISPs.
So I want to give David a chance to respond to all of this, but I just want to shift the conversation slightly given our timing, and along these same lines though, so I think it'll give, hopefully David a chance to respond, but be interested to know, and then this picks up on what you were saying, we were all saying earlier, what the harms are that we are trying to address, because I think it would be useful to talk about what harms are theoretical or speculated to possibly occur in the future, and what are the real harms with, and Jim was getting somewhat at this too at the end, that we are concerned about. And I would just also be interested to hear from folks. We have the FTC, it's our principal privacy regulator in the United States. The FTC has tended to, in its enforcement actions, go after companies that are using data in a way that harms consumers. The EU, which we all know is very active in this area, also has gone after the large platform providers and other entities, and not ISPs. So I think it would be good to get on the table some of those harms and discuss some of the regulatory responses.
Well, let me, having had an accumulated list here of opportunities to, or of things that might warrant responses, let me start not with the last ask, but instead with a piece of it that I just want to make sure doesn't get lost, which is how we should think about this. For example, AT&T Uverse thing, where indeed, as compared with other ISPs, they were relatively better about disclosing what they were doing, and that is that I think that you have to look at Uverse as a product that does something that a lot of other products don't do, including a lot of other internet access products, in terms of the level of service that it provides. And in my opinion, it doesn't have meaningful competition in many of the markets that it operates in. And in my opinion, the $30 a month number that they're charging for privacy is at least based on the publicly available evidence, including the evidence of great interest to investors in the company and its competitors, totally unrelated to any kind of revenue stream that it gets out of that data, which, unless it's getting an order of 10 times as much revenue out of personal data than Google can, which strikes me as not a reasonable supposition, then it's pricing this in a way that's way more than the market value of the data. And I think it's reasonable to ask why it feels comfortable doing that. And I think the answer is because, notwithstanding the things that Jim says that are quite true about how much revenue it gets from each of its users, the truth is that its privacy choices are unlikely to drive very many customers away from its service. I think if it priced the privacy option as a reasonable simulacrum of its actual value to the company, then we'd be looking, I think, at a very different set of numbers. But it's telling that AT&T, for whatever reason, finds it preferable to set a monthly price for privacy that's really in a different ballpark.
Jim, you look like you wanted to respond, but I didn't.
It's in the end, these are new services, new offerings, and I think there's probably some experimentation in what the market would accept. I don't think that it's the world of today's regulation of broadband internet access service to start questioning specifics of pricing when companies are trying to figure out what value consumers place on different types of services, including a privacy-sensitive service. There is no choice about this with regard to most other services on the internet, most of which are free. So it's hard to measure what the value would be, and I think that may explain some of this as well.
Just a small point on that. I mean, if you go to most grocery stores in the United States, if you don't use the loyalty card, you can pay up to twice as much on certain products. I certainly don't think the value of my data to the grocery store is, the double my grocery bill. And I think there's plenty of competition in grocery stores. And I don't think we're talking about regulating them. So, I mean, I don't think that the ISPs are doing something, ununique in this space compared to most other competitive industries. And so I don't think you can just say that this number indicates there's no competition in this space. There's plenty of areas where this similar type of pricing occurs.
So just to go back to this notion of consumer harm and whether the harms justify the asymmetric regulation, and I'll clarify, by asymmetric regulation, what I meant was the treatment of, in this case, ISPs differently than other similarly situated entities. And by that, I mean other players in the online ecosystem, whether it be social networks, search providers, and so forth, that have a great deal of visibility into what consumers are doing online, and indeed, as encryption becomes more standard, will continue to have that visibility, while ISPs' visibility will trail off. And so, just looking as a policy matter, looking forward, would like to try to develop a little bit more what it is that would justify different treatment, because that is certainly, by all accounts, where things look like they're going.
Well, I think when we look at the application layer and whether it is similarly situated to ISPs such that there be a lack of here's where I come down, is if symmetry is, it refers to a situation in which ISPs are not treated like common carriers, then I guess I'm against it. I think that the application layer switching costs, if you're not happy with the services that are provided by the Gmail or the Hotmail or the Yahoo Mail that you may or may not be using, those switching costs are much lower, and the options for the kind of broadband that people, I think, already strongly prefer and will, in the coming future of heightened bandwidth use, increasingly strongly prefer. I think it's just there are not the same kinds of choices there. And so when there is a lack of a option that is privacy preserving on a par with the internet as we've known it up till now, that's meaningfully available to people, to me, that's a very different picture than the one that happens at the application layer.
So I'm just trying to get at what the harm. So the harm, I'm looking for the privacy harm, I guess, and not so much because we're talking about lack of choice in the marketplace. But going back to what the privacy harms are, especially given what we have heard about increasing trends toward greater encryption and what that means for the visibility that entities online will have, ISPs versus other online entities, what are the privacy harms down the road that would justify regulation of ISPs more strictly than other entities? So that's what I apologize if I wasn't clear in that, but that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's always funny what counts as a privacy harm, quote unquote, because my experience is that when the harm actually ramifies and when the troubling risk reaches bad fruition, we tend no longer to regard the issue as a privacy issue. So if, for example, in the context of a job application, I'm worried that something about my status may be used against me, that's a privacy concern. If it is used against me, that's an employment issue. And the same may be true in, we've seen a lot of purchasing of consumer data increasingly by law enforcement authorities as well, and the use of that in emerging, targeting scores. If I'm worried that the police may have a negative view of me or a high threat score for me, as one recently released product that uses commercially brokered data comes in, then I have a privacy concern. But of course, if any of that reaches bad fruition, I have a criminal justice issue. So, I mean, I think the full range of ways in which powerful institutions use sensitive data about people, is implicated by the data that, I leave it to members of the audience to decide whether or not you find that even after stuff is encrypted, there's a sensitive aggregate picture that the ISP has that I would say uniquely has. And I think, it's not in any one place, but it is in fact across the spectrum of ways that powerful institutions use data, that this data, could be used in problematic ways.
I'm not sure, in light of Peter's presentation, particularly as to the different ways that consumers access the internet, that in the course of a day, we could do the same thing. Do you use your smart? We could run through the whole thing, as Peter said. That the ISP actually does have more data in this day and age, and I don't think the quality of the data that it has in a world of HTTPS, which is coming, whatever. I actually used VPN when I was living in France because I didn't want the French intelligence services to be listening in on all the communications I had, but that was a while ago. But with HTTPS coming, I'm not sure that the ISP is going to have more information. And if you think about what an operating system provider sees, for example, if a Netflix communication is once HTTPS goes on with Netflix, the operating system will see the content of the movies decrypted, will know when the user stopped, will be in a position really to gather a lot of information that the ISP will not see. And so I do think that this is a much more complicated picture than the OTI report portrays when you look at the trend over time of more encryption. And yes, Netflix is just one example. On the other hand, Netflix has been a big source of complaints by privacy groups that people would find out what sort of movies you like to watch. That's being foreclosed right now with this move toward encryption. And the fact that a user goes to Netflix, for example, is something that many other players on the internet will know, maybe not knowing the name of the individual, but for advertising purposes, absolutely they will know that. And there really isn't incrementally much more that the ISP has other than the the name and address of the user, and the ISP has more disincentives to do creepy stuff with the information because they don't want to lose the subscriber. And if you look at the whole period of time of FTC regulation of ISPs, form was a blip on the screen, totally failed. I've advised a lot of ISPs on privacy compliance, and anything to do with medical data, whether somebody's unemployed, those are things that are completely off the table because they would be objectionable to users.
Can I just say that I wish I could believe that wireline ISPs providing modern speeds were half as afraid of losing their customers over this kind of thing as Jim seems to be confident that they are.
Well, I think if you were to compare actual practices, you would see that this does not happen. The sorts of harms like targeting people based on their visits to WebMD, and that use of location data under the FTC framework, which is all that needs to be applied by the FCC now that it's categorized broadband internet access service as a common carrier service, is enough to require clear and conspicuous notice and opt-in consent for use of location data anyway. So I think we wind up in more or less the same place to foreclose the harms, but I do think that there's more discipline and also much more reputational risk to a large ISP associated with doing something that would be objectionable from the privacy front. You could point to one or two little circumstances, but it's definitely not the norm.
I mean, there's also the regulatory risk, which I think is important as well. I mean, ISPs, I think, are motivated not to do certain things because they don't want regulators to step in with, overbearing rules on them. So, I think there's a lot of incentive there. But again, I think just coming back to this question, what harms are there to consumers? I think it's important to, again, look at what's happening today. If you look at the options available to consumers at their ISPs, they can opt out of these practices, and they have a number of tools to go further and protect their privacy if they want. Even if you don't think there's competition, you can do these things. So at the end of the day, the question is, what does the FCC need to do to help consumers have the kind of experience they want? Of course, as we know, there's different types of consumers. There's ones that don't care about privacy. There's a bunch of us in the middle, and there's some that really care about it a lot. But even those that care about it a lot, if they can opt out of these practices, if they can have some competition in the marketplace, and if they can access tools to protect their privacy, then the question is, what additional regulation does the FCC really need to do? And so I'm hoping when they're looking at the CP&I rules that they're keeping it very focused on what CP&I was originally about, this kind of basic network information and how it's being used for these limited services.
And with that, I'm afraid we're going to have to close. We're coming to the end. We don't have much time, but if anybody does have questions, I'd love to allow that. Yes, please.
Just a question for David. One of the New American OTI, they publish a number of reports around municipal broadband, Google Fiber, and what have you. If I accept your premise, because they want to see more work done on the side of promoting municipal broadband, and I accept what you're saying, ISPs really have a lot to look, I'd be very concerned about an FCC regulating because of the principal agent problem. Between having more and more municipal broadband providers being ISPs. So I would see a much higher risk of sort of the local municipal provider spying on the people in the community than the ISPs because they're closer. It's like, talking about creepiness, your neighbor who's working at that local facility will actually know the users in the community. So, let me just finish the question real quick. I spent the morning going through the transparency reports from various ISPs, and the high rate of government requests. Max Rams talked about this with Snowden, and to see more and more municipal broadband. We're talking about these kind of things. I'm just concerned in a world where you're carving up the internet. This agency's handling this. Department of Transportation wants to do that. All the internet privacy pieces are regulated by different entities. As a user, I don't really feel like this is a wholesome way to think about it. So that's just my observation. I would say if I accept your premise, I see this concern with principal agent problem with FCC, having more government broadband providers.
Well, I think that, so first of all, it's outside my area to look at the regulation of municipal broadband. I mean, I'm not a telecom regulatory lawyer in the first instance, but what I will say is that I don't think that anything I've said is intended to augur against robust privacy protections on municipal broadband networks. And if indeed there are, risks that are specific to those networks, I think, the right kind of regime across all broadband might well address them, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it at that.
If there aren't any other questions, I want to encourage folks to stay for the zero rating panel, which is coming up next in this room, and there's a panel on the IANA transition across the hall next as well. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the panelists.
Nice job.
Thanks, likewise, yeah.